The following video is about the future of Canada. It's my commentary with respect to where I think the opportunities exist now and in the future, and how Canada could leverage its strengths in order to be able to capitalize upon some of the movements that are currently underway. So before I get into the video, I just wanted to share some brief statistics about Canada. As a sovereign nation, Canada is about 152 years old. The culture is comprised of mostly English-speaking, historically mostly English-speaking communities, and communities from France. So you have two distinct languages being spoken in Canada because of the cultural heritage. It's got a rich history with respect to the early settlers and the fur trading companies, and the different treaties that have been signed. Obviously there's that American-Canadian dynamic, which has worked for both the countries for a long period of time now, and continues to work with so much of our trade and our security tied in with the American interest. But I wanted to focus on Canada because I see a lot of opportunities and a lot of room for enlightened growth and sustainable growth, or growth through sustainable means. And Canada can, and I believe should, play an emerging role, leveraging its strengths in a gentle, kinder fashion, which Canada has done so historically. So again, going back to the stats, 152 years old, spoke briefly about the cultures. There are 10 provinces and 3 territories. Take a look at my notes as I go along. The population stands at 37, slightly over 37 million as of last year. These are stats from statsCan, which is Government of Canada's statistics ministry or system. There are a couple of major political parties, and first of all, it is a democracy, so it's a representative democracy, which means that people go to vote every 4 years, and they choose who's going to govern, and the parties themselves select a leader before that, obviously. And I would categorize Canada as kind of like a social democratic institution, not unlike most of the democracies that we see across the Western Hemisphere, if not the world. And so the 3 political parties are in random order, or I guess alphabetical, the Conservative Party of Canada, you have the Green Party, you have the Liberal Party, and then you have the New Democratic Party. So yeah, it's just a kind of brief summarization of this kind of like a framework of the Canadian institution. And what a great coincidence that I'm recording this video and there's a map of Canada in the background. Totally coincidence. It's a complete coincidence. I haven't had the map here, but anyways. So I wanted to start with the basics, and in terms of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, everybody on this planet needs food, water, shelter, security, education, healthcare, entertainment, and I would also include a couple of other things in this list. I would make this list longer, first of all, but I think things like roads, bridges, dental work, quality of life with respect to parks and recreation, gardens, dental work. I think I've already mentioned that. I would include these realities and more into the basic needs, and I'm not sure with respect to how the systems should be architected, but as it relates to the defense and healthcare and education, I believe that the government should play a pivotal role here. Now, my views have changed in the past couple of years, and I think I tend to lean towards like the socialist, social democracy kind of front. So I think governments can and should play a pivotal role with respect to some of the systems I mentioned. Again, primarily education in random order: education, healthcare, and the defense, which includes security of the citizen. So that's a broader conversation, and I think failing to do so would. So let's focus on the positives. So I think that should be the part of the government's primary responsibility. Again, for the third time, education, healthcare, quality education, quality healthcare, including quality basic dental work, and the security and the safeguarding of the citizens and the nation's interest, or the interest of the institution. So, with respect to how the basics can and should be provisioned, I got lines on my forehead. Yeah, that's serious. So, I think the public-private participation should be encouraged, and innovation should be incentivized in order to be able to get breakthroughs and find efficiencies in how things are done. And I think the way we should be doing this is to see which technologies are maturing or about to mature on which time spectrum, and then leverage these technologies in order to be able to do what I've just shared. So in terms of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, I'm going to start with food. And completely random. So Canada does pretty well with food production. Most of the crops are produced in-house, exception of I guess crops like rice, tea, coffee, and sugar. So some crops obviously require a different kind of climate, which doesn't exist in Canada. It's a country far north of the equator, which puts it in there's a diverse climate. It's a big country, first of all. There's a lot of land mass, but by and large, you cannot categorize any one of the areas in Canada as tropical. So when it comes to food, at least for the next 5 to 6 years. Actually, let me backtrack. So I'm just going to get to what I'm thinking. So in the past couple of months, I have come across the news item. Let me add an action item here. In the past couple of months, I've come across the news of the Netherlands, as I had no idea that the Netherlands was the second largest exporter of food in the world. So it's a country the size of Manhattan, and if you look at the map of the world, Manhattan is a very small tract of land, and a country the size of Manhattan produces so much food that it has now become the second largest exporter of food in the world. This is after the United States, which, comparatively speaking, doesn't have that much land mass if you compare it to Asia or Africa or any other place. But the gains that the agriculture system in the United States have made is primarily due to innovations in different technologies and systems, especially after World War II. So stuff like the Haber-Bosch principle, which may very well have been a European, I'm not sure who, I think it was a European invention, but it was, actually I'm not going to get into like these things that I'm not super, but basically the Americans have invested in a lot of different technologies in different arenas, which have allowed them to have massive surplus and as it relates to food. And so America is the largest exporter of food in the world. But again, Netherlands is, what they're doing in the Netherlands is phenomenal. Just scraping the surface of what's going on there, it warrants that everybody pay attention to this. So what I'm thinking is that people should send teams, entrepreneurial and like teams made up of students and academics from the world of academia to Netherlands, and these teams should spend time there and learn how the Dutch are doing what they're doing, and then bring back these practices and implement it in their settings. So this opportunity is open for everyone in Russia and China. I'm just looking at the map going from right to left. In other parts of Asia, in Africa, across Europe, obviously Netherlands part of the European Union, across North America, South America. So like everyone should send delegations, and not to forget Australia and other places, and learn from what the Dutch are doing and replicate that for their society. Canada can benefit so much from this. There are agricultural communities across Canada. Agriculture is comprised of many different domains, but generally speaking, you have different classes with respect to crops, and there are different kinds of crops. And then you have animal farming, and then you have I think it's primarily these two. There could be other sub-industries like fisheries, and like obviously there's different kinds of appetites across the world. So, but generally speaking, you can I lost my train of thought, but so I think Canada should send scouts to the Netherlands, learn, and then incentivize different teams to work on different bring back those practices and implement them in Canada, so we can start producing food the way that they do it in the Netherlands. Not only will this result in I don't know what kind of rates we're looking at, but we'll see massive improvements, and we're going to see a net increase and as it relates to the output, which will help Canada also take the lead and as it relates to food production or exporting food, whether it's raw or unprocessed formed, or it's some kind of processed fashion, even if it's canned goods or some like companies making food related items and exporting them to the wider world. So I would like, this is just in random order. So I would start there with the Netherlands, and teams could come together, and many new approaches will be tried with vertical farming and maybe dome-shaped structures, aquaponics, hydroponics, using like the waste from the fisheries and like recycling that for the plants and vegetables that are being grown, and many other innovations and experiments like this, including growing algae farms and spirulina and maybe mushrooms for cultivation and consumption, and it's a long list. So I would start there with the Netherlands and see the Dutch are doing again and go from there. Water is generally not a problem in Canada. Canada is the land of there's the Great Lakes. Obviously, you can see them from space. So one of the largest bodies of fresh water in the world. So Canada is quite lucky in that domain. I'm not sure what kind of impact climate change is going to have on the lakes, but I'm not too concerned on the waterfront. Wherever the Canadian cities are situated, by and large, cities across the world are generally located next to a river system, and in Canada's case, is either next to a river system or a lake. So I'm not concerned, but there are also technologies in development that would allow us to recycle water. Filter it. So I'm not going to speak too much about water because that's not I don't think it's a problem for Canada. I do think that we should invest the time, energy, and the necessary cycles for basic research, and as it relates to protecting the health of the lakes, because most of the population in Canada, I think, lives in a part of Ontario. I'm not sure, like some substantial amount of population for Canada lives around the Great Lakes. So our quality of life is inherently tied in with the health of the lake or the lakes, and that's, I think, a very important thing. So I'll leave it at that. Shelter. Let's talk about shelter. Housing is becoming unsustainable in terms of the cost. So when I first came to Canada 20 years ago, housing was affordable. You could afford to buy a house if you had an average income. I don't know what the average income around that time would be, but I think the first couple of jobs I was like, once I moved from like working in, like I did the jobs that all new immigrants do, and then I got a job in the technology sector. So I think my first couple of paychecks were in the like heavy kind of 30s or late 30s or early 40s domain. And this goes back to the early 2000s. So I don't think I could afford a house then, but I could afford a house 5 or 6 years or 7 or 8 years later, and I did. So my point is that wages were at a place on average that would allow most of the individuals to purchase a house. If your wage was close to the national average, then you could afford to purchase a house. It was not a problem. You could definitely afford to purchase a house if both the partners were working, in a couple sense, or a couple of people getting together and buying a house, 2 or more. In the past 7 to 8 years, that situation has changed because the price of housing has kept on almost increasing by some crazy margin. And wages obviously have not kept pace. So this has created a general, in my opinion, inaffordability, is that a word? Basically, a lot of young people are not able to afford housing, I think. So I've heard recently the government has released some laws, or there's some help for millennials with respect to being able to afford a house. I just don't know the details because I haven't had time. I think housing is a big issue. There are a couple of ways to solve this problem. One of them is to look into changing municipal codes or laws and allowing a different kind of housing system to exist. And here I'm referring to houses that aren't exactly made in a traditional sense. So they would be more like tiny homes or tiny houses. And there's a bunch of different ways via which you can manufacture or set up these systems that are quite robust and quite safe. And they're cheaper. and the mortgages on these structures is also a lot less expensive compared to the traditional mortgage that you'd see at a place like the Greater Toronto area, which is where I live. I cannot afford to buy a house right now, but I could probably afford to buy a tiny house, and I could probably live in that tiny house with my daughter and my partner. If it's just the three of us, we could make do. We could totally make do in a tiny house, and I would have my I would be able to live in a respectful way. I would be able to. It's a big issue for me. Housing is a big issue, and that's one way. So tiny homes would be one way. The other would be to build infrastructure that would connect the parts of Ontario. Like, I'm talking in the Ontario sense, but this applies for most of Canada. So like in a place like Ontario, we could connect places that are far up north with a new aid system like the Hyperloop once it goes into implementation, which will allow us to shrink the travel time considerably. And doing so would mean that somebody could afford to buy a house that's on average $300,000. If it's a tiny house, it's even cheaper. And they would sit, say if they work downtown, and then would sit in one of these Hyperloop kind of vehicles in the downtown region, and they would be at their destination within 35 minutes, 40 minutes, or less. If this thing's going 600 kilometers per hour or 600 miles per hour, it's probably less time. Because there's a lot of real estate outside of the GT area that can be developed, but choking the highway system and people sitting in the highway system for 2.5 hours each day, commuting back and forth is not the strategy. So that's another way. And the third one is, there's a lot of different ways. The third one is telepresence. So leveraging technologies like telepresence. People, I think, generally tend to get depressed when they work from home too much. So one way is to do telepresence, but do it from a place that is designed so people can come and work collaboratively from there. And I've shared another idea, and I call it open places. And I think there's merit in entertaining ideas like this. Wide open spaces that can be rented for super cheap, because you really just need the basic necessities, which are getting cheaper by the day. You need like an open space and internet, and obviously maintain the facility, so you pay a cost for that. It's anywhere from $100 per month and up, depending on how you use it. And you kind of have these facilities available so people could come and work from there, and you could have daycare facility on the side and a couple other things, just up to your imagination. And then you have telepresence as well from these places. I look to see like how virtual reality would change the nature of work. Sorry, I think I need new glasses because my eyes, I think, are getting weaker. That was just a topic on the side. But yeah, so I think I've spoken enough about shelter. Just a couple ideas on how shelter can be made more affordable or accessible. Third one is education, or fourth one. Food, water, shelter. Sorry, security is next in my list. So Canada is pretty good, and as it relates to provisioning security for a tiny country in terms of population, it does a pretty phenomenal job. Obviously, our security interests are by and large tied in with the security interests of the United States. We I think share the largest open border in the world with the Americans, and I think the security system works. It works on a federal level. It also works in a municipal level. Canada is probably one of the safest places in the world, if not the safest. Sorry, just pop up. And in my 20 years of living in Canada, I have never witnessed personally a period of time where things were not secure. There's no perfect security system. Every country has incidents. Canada is not an exception. But I've lived in South Asia and I've seen the general situation for security deteriorate in South Asia growing up as a kid, as a teenager. I have never seen that in Canada, and I never want to. Knock on wood, security, Canada does really well. The Canadian citizenship has very high standards, so the high standards are maintained by ensuring that the security of all Canadian citizens is a priority, and everyone is treated equally with respect to security. So I think Canada is doing pretty good with security. I don't know much about this domain, so I can't speak of it further. But Canada should also invest in not heavily invest, but I think Canada does fine. So seeing how which cycles are going to mature and absorbing that into its security architecture, Canada is going to do just fine in this realm. Education is next. In terms of education, Canada has good primary and secondary education institutes. This works for a variety of reasons. Historically, there is a tradition of maintaining standards and exceeding and pushing those standards. So, in terms of education, again, Canada ranks high in global rankings, produces, there's a good output in terms of the research quality for the tiny nation, or in population terms. And I think it's a pretty good education system, but it should also experiment with new ways via which education can be imparted, and I think Canada is going to do well here. We'll continue to make the investments and do well. Let's talk about basics. So I'm not going to talk about research. I'll keep it at that. Healthcare is next. Healthcare is universal in Canada. That means if you are a Canadian citizen, healthcare is free. It's free for most of the procedures. It's not free for procedures like cosmetic surgery or dental work, which I don't think should be in the same category. I think dental work should be free. This is, again, my personal belief or opinion. And I think some cosmetic surgery is even is free in Canada, because if there's disfigurement because of accident or something, or somebody's quality of life is negatively impacted and cosmetic surgery is required. So I think that is covered under the universal healthcare system. What I'm not sure about is, what I want to say is, I think basic dental work should be covered under the healthcare umbrella. My opinion, I've never had to use the healthcare system for anything other than, one time I contracted a bug when I went out of the country, and my stomach was really upset for a couple of weeks, and that's probably the only time I had a scare and I had to use the healthcare facility. And there have been other times where I have to go for tests and whatnot. I think the Canadian healthcare system works. Sometimes there's delays, especially if your issue is not urgent, which is understandable because there's other people in the priority queue. By and large, the healthcare system works. I would not change anything drastically, like some of the new laws that are being proposed in Ontario with respect to the consolidation and the funding cuts. I'm concerned about that, and I actually want to talk to people about that. I've already reached out to at least one or two individuals saying that I want to learn more about this because they were part of the healthcare community or system. And my personal philosophy, which I'm not going to talk too much about in this video, is that any suffering that can be avoided should be avoided. And with that philosophy in mind, I think the Canadian healthcare institutions play a core and pivotal part in helping reduce human suffering. And I think the system works. And I think we should continue to invest in these systems, in the healthcare system, and make them more vibrant and more accessible, and more accessible and better, considering where medicine is going overall with precision medicine, maybe CRISPR, so advanced genetic therapies, and maybe other breakthroughs. Who knows how the advances in computation and materials will how medicine will benefit from this, or healthcare in general. So do well, and we already do well in healthcare, and there's always room for improvement. So I didn't come up with an exhaustive list for Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I've got entertainment on there, on par compared to the earthly construct. If you make an average kind of per capita kind of, like if your yearly wages are on the same scale as what most of the people in your nation are earning, then you can afford good entertainment in Canada. And but you can always push the limits and create different avenues for entertainment, maybe with virtual reality, maybe augmented reality, and have arcades come up. And that doesn't have to say that that's the only way, but just some of the ways I can think of. So the next segment, because I said it's not an exhaustive list and it relates to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. The next segment is playing to its strengths. So the way I see it, these are some of the strengths for Canada. And I may be repeating some of this information because I did speak more than I should have, and as it relates to some of the basics. So in random order, I think the quality primary and secondary education for Canada it's one of its core strengths, again in random order. The universal healthcare system is one of Canada's core strengths. It's got really good infrastructure, so the roads are always paved, the water always flows, heating systems, the provisions to be able to supply gas and electricity, it's always there. Telecommunication systems are always wired up. Security is always there when you need it. What else is part of the basic? So the infrastructure is pretty great. It's pretty good. Effective immigration would be also one of Canada's core strengths. Canada does a pretty good job at attracting the best and the brightest from around the world. Some portion of the best and the brightest do end up going to the States or elsewhere, or maybe they go back, but Canada does a pretty good job of attracting good people from around the world. It's pretty humane too. It's not just all numbers and super smart people from around the world. It's actually quite humane that the Canadian system is open to a lot of people. from around the world. So I would say immigration is definitely Canada's one of the big strengths, and I said towards the beginning of the video with respect to the culture. I gotta plug this laptop in because I'm gonna go to sleep. Tired. Yeah, so I was talking about the two cultures. At this point in time, Canada is more than two cultures. There's a lot of different other cultures, largely due to immigration that can be found. Like there's a Punjabi community, obviously. There's people from in random order, people from all other parts of Asia, and there are different communities in different regions. There's obviously a lot of European, and there's like people from all over the world come to Canada, and you've got a very vibrant community of people from all the different parts of the world, and it contributes towards Canada's well-being and diversity. Another one of Canada's strengths is the entrepreneurial system or network that is developing. So having lived in Kitchener-Waterloo, I noticed this firsthand, how this system, the local network there was already transitioning from a manufacturing base to software economy. And I haven't been in contact with what's going on in Kitchener-Waterloo the past couple of years, but it'll be interesting to see how the leap towards the next areas of growth can be made. Same with Toronto. Toronto is a lot more bigger, obviously, and a lot more diverse. And I'm not sure about the other entrepreneurial ecosystems across Canada. I think there are pockets, smaller pockets around the remainder of the federation. But the system is definitely developing, is going to take roots, and is going to thrive in the futures. It ranks consistently high in global rankings when it comes to entrepreneurial activity. So there's a lot of good things happening in the ecosystem. And by rethinking a couple of key parameters, Canada could really become a power player. I would say even to effect that, like, I think it's quite achievable to be able to make some key calculated changes which would result in massive amounts of wealth being generated in a relatively 10 to 12 year time frame, which would put Canada on a different trajectory right now, because right now it seems like the depth per capita has been increasing, which is a cause of concern, because you don't want the depth per capita to increase. That's not a good that's not a good sign, and we've got to look at what's causing that. But changing a couple of things could definitely make Canada a super prosperous country in a 10-15 year time frame. It could make Canada one of the most prosperous countries on Earth and across the solar system. I can speak of that if anyone is interested. I'm always open to talk and consult with elites in random order, members of the community, local politicians, mayors, member of parliaments, premiers, prime minister, who else? Entrepreneurs, yes, and share ideas on how more growth and more abundance and more wealth can be generated. there's nothing stopping Canada from having, the best standards of living in the world, setting the bar high, universal basic income, universal basic infrastructure, and massive amounts of wealth generation on top. There's nothing stopping Canada from, that's just the start. That is just the beginning. So yeah, the entrepreneurial ecosystems are thriving and developing. I think they should be geared towards, there should be like a broader perspective, but also a focused perspective, which I'll talk about when I talk about industry-specific developments. Next, I want to talk in terms of the strengths. I want to talk about the culture. The Canadian culture is a vibrant mosaic of different cultures, as I shared. And I think Canada does a pretty good job at weaving all these cultures together, and you can have your own cultural autonomy or identity, and you can have a Canadian identity, and almost everyone is able to make this work. And from the perspective of the citizenship, which is a privilege, the rights and the gifts are given to everyone. Everyone has equal access to healthcare facilities and libraries and securities and educational opportunities, or opportunity domain of pursuing education and career development. So the culture is pretty vibrant. It's very vibrant. There's a lot of beauty and wonder in the natural habitat which people can freely go out and enjoy, and the culture promotes beautiful things like art and expression, so you can go and visit art galleries and museums, get a sense and a taste of the human experience. I find there's solid institutions in the GTA region, but I find the art galleries in particular, the one time I went to Ottawa, I find that it's really well curated. It's got a lot of classics in rotation, and it's just a phenomenal institution. That's not to say that's the culture, and there's like so many different aspects of the Canadian culture, with the Native American culture and Anglo-Saxon, I would say, and the French culture, and all the other cultures that I shared. Next is attracting the best and the brightest, which I've already spoken about, but I also wanted to again speak about this in a Thomas Friedman sense. He's got a good TED talk or a video on, I forget the title of it, but I made a blog post about it, but he speaks quite eloquently on attracting the best and the brightest. My next segue talks about some of the industry-specific developments. So before I begin, I must say that I am a singularitarian. I think there's a high degree of probability that we may experience steps towards a technological singularity within the next, I have no idea what time frame. Could have already happened many times. It may happen in the future in an earthly context. But being a singularitarian, I believe that the technological curves are on some path. This is coming from Ray Kurzweil. So, and the rate at which these technologies are progressing or exceeding, this is on a logarithmic scale. This appears to be an exponential curve. It's a very smooth curve. And as these technologies and systems mature, things are going to get very interesting. So abundance is a natural byproduct of these developments. The question then becomes for the earthly construct, and with respect to this video, in a Canadian construct, is how should we leverage this abundance? So if we are seeing material abundance and abundance in every single domain or facet of our lives, relating to Maslow's hierarchy of needs and a lot more, and now we have more free time too, perhaps with more automation, or new ways of how work can be completed or done, which would mostly be automation. But automation would not be just with robotics, it would also be with the mental faculties. So now you have more time. How do you invest that time? These are all good questions. So my personal philosophy is more beauty, more wonder, more beautiful experiences, more pleasure, more fun. Because why not? And the question is, as there is more abundance, then what should we do? And I've already answered some thoughts, like I've already shared some thoughts, but like as it relates to industry specific, the abundance that we're going to experience is driven primarily, I think, based on the massive amounts of investments that have been made in the domain of basic research. So this is an earthly phenomena, and other countries are also picking up on this phenomena, primarily places like India and China, which is going to, they're going to be massive drivers of global progress now and in the future. There's a lot of things to be kind of worked on, like, but I don't think they're like super. There's serious issues with respect to like intellectual property and intellectual property rights, and I do not want to discard that conversation in no way, shape, or form. But going back to what I was talking about, it's quite given that the world's on a path towards abundance. I've shared one very concrete example with respect to what the Netherlands is doing. Soon we're going to see abundance of energy. We're going to have so much energy within the next 10 years. We're going to have indoor farming. We're going to have transportation systems that go 600 miles per hour. We're going to be able to go from Toronto to Shanghai within 1 hour. Yes, it will be possible. We'll be able to go from Tokyo to LA in 1 hour. And you could go anywhere within 1 hour. At least 1 hour. Sorry, at the most 1 hour. So this is just the beginning. So in a world where there is no scarcity, you can go wherever you want. You can create almost whatever you want. And you have all these massive avenues available to you. What will you do and what will you create? That's a good question. What I was referring to was that the growth that is being driven, the underlying principle is basic research that has been happening for hundreds of years. This research being turned into applied research and eventually into innovation. And so this is why we all experience or enjoy a higher standard of living. The standard of living today is exponentially better compared to the standard of living 1,000 years ago. It's even massively better compared to the standard of living 200 years ago. The way you live today is how the kings and the queens would have lived 200 years ago. And 20 years from now, everyone will be living like a king or a queen. The standard of living for everyone will be that of the standard of living of a billionaire. And within 10 years, the standard of living for everyone will be equal to the standard of living for millionaires today. You'll be able to summon cars, and the cars will be there within minutes, if not seconds. You'll be able to go from point A to B or C for a very small amount of money, because energy is going to be so cheap. And you'll have precision medicine, and you will have new ways to heal your body and potentially your mind. There will be very less suffering. A lot of suffering would be avoidable. So to keep this momentum going, we need to invest in certain areas, and I think the areas on that path towards maturation are the following. In random order again: the frontier of space, space exploration, colonization, mining. By colonization, I mean breathing life into dead rocks, so terraforming them, starting off with small scale facilities, and eventually creating tiny movements that has a seismic effect on the atmosphere and on the ecology of that planet, for the planet to be made habitable by us. That's made based on the assumption that we still choose to live as beings in a biological substrate in the future, but that's another conversation. But space, the exploration and the development of space will benefit humans immensely. There is no price tag that can be put on this development, because if you really want to equate or calculate the net positive impact this is going to have on the earthly economy or the solar system wide economy within the next 25-30 years, it could run into hundreds of trillions of dollars. So at some point money will become irrelevant. But this is one of the biggest opportunities, I think. I did say random order, so I'll stick with it. It's totally random. This synthetic biology is next, and this is not just related to just making food or like tinier organisms or different means of or grafting organs. This is going to be very interesting as we take steps in the future. And I don't know much about this area, so I won't talk about this too much. But I think that's going to be a big area in the future. Genetics is next, and I think there is a wide and varied ways through which genetics could evolve. And it's not just related to health, which is a pretty broad spectrum itself. It could also be used for computation, for maybe powering the internet from a storage sense. So if you have a super clustered a global computer that everyone's kind of plugged into, and you need storage for that, then DNA could be one form of storage. And considering how we choose to push genetics, we could potentially come up with a cure for aging and potentially all diseases. And these are all opportunities that's got hard to put a number on it. Canada should take a jump right into it. So we've got a we've got so many amazing and smart individuals across this federation, and they should be pursuing opportunities in these realms, from Calgary to Vancouver, from Toronto to Kitchener, Waterloo to New Brunswick to Newfoundland, Saskatchewan, Northwestern Territories, Thunder Bay. And that's just, I'm not going to get a chance to name all the places, but there's so many amazing places in Canada, so many amazing people. Montreal, the place I love. I love the people, I love the culture, I love the vibe. And it would be great to have more people pursuing opportunities in some of these areas on an upward trend. We need to create more wealth so we can have a better standard of living. Is standard of living good? but we can make it a lot better. These are some of the areas. Artificial intelligence would be next. Toronto is already a key player in the world of artificial intelligence, mostly with the work that's been done in the University of Toronto, and a lot more opportunities remain. And there's many ethical and good use of AI. AI is generally classified in 3 different domains. One is what's going on right now with machine learning, and basically set up the data in such a way that the machine can learn from the data and how it's architectured. The other one is deep learning, which I don't understand very well, so I'm not going to talk about it. And I guess the holy grail, actually I shouldn't use that word because it could be misconstrued, but the steps are towards something like a general purpose intelligence. I don't call it artificial because I don't think it's like intelligence need be on a biological substrate, so we're saying if it's not biological substrate then it's artificial, which sounds silly. I would just say it's a different form of intelligence, and as we take steps towards this different form of intelligence, which may not be very different, it just enables us to solve some of the more seemingly complex problems, which is a huge thing. This is a different conversation by itself, but what the premiers from the other provinces and different delegations, academia should be doing is coming to the clusters where this innovation is already happening and learning, and we involve the military and in the intelligence, and we do this in a good way, in a safe way, so that we can benefit from this amazing opportunity. This is definitely one of the strengths for Canada, and Canada should leverage it. Agritech, we've already spoken about this a bit. There's many clusters of developments here with Guelph and potentially other parts across Canada. Learn from the Netherlands, learn from what's going on in even places like China, where they're able to turn vast amounts of tracts of desert into arable land. We're not going to need that right now, but let's figure out how we can leverage that as a strength. I'm not doing a good job at Agritech here but we all need food, and yeah. The other ones I have on my list are nanotechnology, material science, and I don't know how Canada is doing in these two realms, but we have a lot of manpower and a lot of cognitive capacity in order to be able to explore this further. And the last but not the least, Canada should continually sustain a cycle of basic research. The thing that feeds the entire engine, it's basic research. Now, I don't think the government or anyone should pick favorites, and I don't think you should ever say that. Let me think about this. We have a lot of money, and we're going to enable more money, because if you have energy abundance, then it's nothing stopping the government from adopting something like a blockchain technology, and then you can invest all sorts of research in all sorts of domains, the sciences, social sciences, in psychology, evolutionary biology, across the realms, in the arts, and we should support all kinds of research, and supporting this research is what keeps the engine going. So this is I'm so sorry. I did not mean to do that. I'm getting tired. This is my I gotta go.